The queer rite of passage known as coming out can be traced back as early as the beginning of the 1900s, where it referred to someone entering into the gay community of the time, particularly drag balls and parties. A cheeky nod to the debutante scene where young women would debut into upper-class society at coming out parties. Nowadays, we're more likely to hear it referred to as coming out of the closet, opening up to others and owning our identity. Since then, this act of self-expression and affirming one's identity has been the narrative driving force of a significant amount of queer cinema, reflecting its importance to many of us in our own lives. Whether it's a teen coming-of-age drama, an offbeat comedy, or a fantasy classic, coming out narratives are uniquely queer. When I was 12 years old, a woman came to my form room to run a workshop on a topic that I honestly can't recall now. What I do remember vividly was that part of the session involved what I'm sure that she thought was a fun interactive exercise. Cleared the desk to the side of the room, she said, clearly thinking that she was about to become the cool adult for a bunch of not quite teens. Everyone, come to the front of the room. The exercise involved her reading a series of what-if questions. If your answer was no, then you stayed where you were, and if your answer was yes, then you had to walk to the other side of the classroom. I don't remember any of the questions except for one. All I know is that up until that one fateful question, the answers were reasonably split. At least a handful of people answered yes to each. Then she asked, if a friend came out to you as gay, would you see them the same way? I strode across the empty space of that classroom, turned around, and found everyone else in my class staring at me from the opposite side of the room. I never regretted that short walk, but it painted a clear target on my back from that day on.
You look sadder.
What? Sorry?
Could you cry a little there?
Cry?
That was good, but you need to make them feel the sadness you must have felt in that classroom.
Oh, I wasn't really sad. I was frustrated. I was angry.
No. This is a scene where you break down for the first time and cry.
I'm sorry, I don't. First, let's break down some of the common opposing axes on which coming out movies can be plotted. Uplifting versus traumatic. These are the fundamental opposite ends of the coming out spectrum. Often, these movies will deliberately fall into one camp or the other, potentially to make a point about the difficulties of coming out, or to portray an idealized version of the process. In general, the realm of trauma has more entries, films like Pariah, Brokeback Mountain, or My Own Private Idaho, whereas on the sweeter end, there are movies like Strange World or The Way He Looks. One of the most well-known coming out movies of the past few years is, of course, the teen drama Love, Simon. This was particularly significant because of its place as a theatrical release from a major studio alongside a gay teen lead, and the movie goes out of its way to guide the audience through a gentle teen romance, with the trials of coming out or being outed providing the main plot tension. Although there are a number of moments in the movie where characters find out that Simon is gay, the speech his mother gives in particular was designed to pull on the heartstrings of cinema goers, partly a conversation between mother and son, and partly a monologue seemingly written to talk directly with the queer teenagers and parents in the audience. It gives us a tearful affirmation of parental love. But these moments of coming out aren't always met with a simple happily ever after. Scenes of rejection, ignorance, and estrangement are just as common, reflecting the real-life experiences of many people in the queer community. Dee Ree's Pariah gives us a slow but seemingly inevitable breakdown of the relationship between Lee and her mother Audrey, as Audrey tries to force Lee into feminine clothes and friendships with fellow churchgoers. She clearly suspects her daughter might be gay, but rather than working to accept her for who she is, pushes these external changes in hopes of triggering an internal change in her sexuality. Lee's coming out scene is one of a desperate in-the-moment confession met with violence and rejection from Audrey. Rather than give us a neatly tied-up image of parental acceptance by the end, we're left with the more bittersweet note of Lee moving forwards into a new life on her own. First act versus final scene. Coming out in these movies serves as either the start of a character's journey or the culmination of it. For this reason, you'll notice coming out scenes usually take place in the first or last 20 minutes of the movie, like Boy Erased or Happiest Season, respectively. Some movies, like cult classic But I'm a Cheerleader, even manage to have both, with the assumption of the lead Megan's sexuality at the start and a public declaration of queerness from her herself at the end as she accepts her own feelings. Although the traditional idea of a coming out focuses around revealing your sexuality to someone else, the first coming out is, of course, the one you do to yourself. But I'm a Cheerleader plays with this often difficult process, with Megan being sent to a gay conversion therapy camp before she even realises that she is gay. The pastel blues and pinks of the movie's stylized production design highlight the restrictive and nonsensical roles that these queer teens are being forced to play, boxed in by arbitrary gender stereotypes, and given a comedic satirical lens to the devastating practice of conversion therapy. When Megan dons her cheerleading costume at the end of the film, she is both rejecting the binaries of the camp uniforms while reclaiming the possibilities of reconciling her old self and her new knowledge of who she is. Although her cheerleading sequence at the close of the film, where she performs a routine for Graham, the girl that she's fallen for, is an iconic coming out scene in its own right, the small moments leading up to this, where Megan is beginning to understand her attraction to Graham, are equally important coming out moments. From unconscious fantasies of a relationship with Graham to the electrifying intensity of a brush of fingers on her arm, Megan needs to go through this process of self-discovery to get to the triumphant moment where she feels able to be honest about being a lesbian. Coming out versus outing. The final oppositional element of these narratives is whether the character chooses to come out themselves or is outed by someone else. In the movie Pride, we have a direct contrast of these two experiences. The character of Cliff chooses to come out in a scene near the end of the film, and the tense relief from him, a casual acceptance from his friend Havina, contrasts with the younger character Bromley's much more traumatic coming out scene. By giving both reactions time in the story, it neither sensationalizes queer suffering nor ignores the very real rejection many queer people face. Part of what makes Bromley's coming out so difficult is the fact that he was outed, taking away his agency and forcing him into a position of powerlessness in the story and his own life. In a twist on the typical narrative, both Handsome Devil and GBF have queer characters out other queer people. Ned and Tanner's reckoning with what they have done to the boys that they claim to care about is a key element of their character development and redemption through the respective movies. It demonstrates the destructive power of self-hatred and anger while combining with their own understanding of how devastating coming out could be. After that workshop when I was 12, I was the last to leave the classroom, and my form tutor at the time, who hadn't said anything when the whispers and smirks started during the session, leant in to whisper, "Good for you." She never mentioned anything about it again, but the other students did. If I was openly admitting to not being bothered by gay people, then the logic went I must be gay myself. And so I endured homophobic bullying from that day until I left the school 6 years later. I didn't know I was gay myself until halfway through those 6 years.
But you were gay.
Okay, yeah, no, I guess.
You were born gay.
Yeah, I suppose, but I hadn't experienced feeling queer, knowing my queerness, having a sense of it until I was a teenager.
You were born gay.
Yes, but
you always knew.
No, I
Deep
didn't. No, that's
down.
not always how it... Do we still need coming out stories? Coming out is an important part of many queer people's lives. Coming out is the most important moment in queer people's lives. For many, the process of coming out can be a difficult and even dangerous one, and these stories can provide a sense of validation and support for those who are struggling with their identity. It's a unique experience to the queer community and a cornerstone of LGBTQ+ narratives from the past few decades. We still live in a world entrenched in heteronormativity, that is the assumption that everyone is straight until proven otherwise. Most media you watch or read, the adverts on TV, the songs you hear on the radio, almost all of them focus on straight people. Heterosexuality is treated as the default, meaning that acknowledging that you don't fit into that default is as important as it ever has been, and potentially just as difficult for many. In an article around National Coming Out Day, writer Hayden Manders explains, "Coming out is still very much an act of protest, defiance and self-assurance. The reality is we queers have been here forever because we haven't been allowed to exist publicly." Coming out inherently challenges these structures of power on an individual and a mass scale. What's seen as normal, natural, acceptable is complicated by every open closet door. And so creating stories which reflect and replicate this continues this process to a wider audience. For LGBTQ+ people watching and consuming these narratives, there can be a sense of catharsis in seeing the triumphant ending of a joyful coming out scene, or potentially a feeling of being seen and having their reality reflected in stories where the coming out doesn't go so smoothly. Showing loving parents, supportive friends, and happy queer lives through the coming out process is a way way of giving reassurance to young people. It can help them
live their authentic truth and stop lying.
For straight audiences, coming out narratives can be a less didactic method of explaining an identity or experience. Not just a dictionary definition, but an easy introduction wrapped up in a compelling narrative, and a journey of self-discovery which is a staple of Western character arcs. Even if they don't have a one-for-one comparison to their own feelings about their sexuality, they may well still understand the idea of internal struggles, figuring out aspects of your identity, or having issues with self-acceptance and self-love. Coming out stories provide a point of reference for others outside of the experience, friends, parents, other family members, to better understand and contextualize what it means to come out. In a 2018 article, Tim Mulgren interviewed 3 teenagers for Mike.com who came out after watching Love, Simon, or used the film as a starting point for conversations that they wanted to have with their loved ones. One respondent said, "After watching Love, Simon with my dad, I came out to him in the car. I had the courage to come out to my parents because of this movie. This movie's important. Please go and see it. I cannot stress enough how important and life-changing this movie is for the LGBTQ+ community." Another said, "I'd read the book previously, so I already knew the story, but when I saw the trailer, I was in the theatre with my mum and I was like, oh my gosh, this looks really good. And she was like, oh, I don't know about that, because she wasn't 100% on board with LGBTQ stuff. But when we saw the movie, she actually cried watching it, so I think that eased her into it before I told her. And I thought about doing it before, but I never went through with it, just because I was scared of what my parents would think. But once I saw the movie, it bottled up inside of me almost, and I felt like I had to get out."
And did you get your courage to come out from a movie that you saw?
No.
That's such a nice way to tie it all together. Now your job involves analysing the kind of movies that helped you come out as a teen.
But that's not how If you follow me on TikTok, you'll know that I am a food girl to my core, so thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. When they reached out, I obviously was all over that. I'm sure you know the concept. They deliver fresh produce and quality ingredients right to your door, going from farm to your plate in less than a week. Food you use to make recipes that showcase the flavours of the season. This year, one of my resolutions was to try more recipes that I haven't made before, because I tend to get stuck in a rut, so this was obviously perfect for that. I would never think to cook duck for myself for some reason, but here I am, adding a new recipe to my repertoire. Maybe this new year you're changing up your meals too, or wanting to eat less meat or go fully veggie. Well, they have a ton of options to give you inspiration wherever your preferences lie. And you can customize your choices, so you can swap out different proteins and sides for another that you prefer, or even upgrade to like a super fancy date night type dish. The recipes are nice and simple, only take about half an hour or less to complete, and have step-by-step guides including photos of what everything should be looking like as you go along. Plus, if you want to grab some options for food outside of just dinner time, then HelloFresh Market is a one-stop shop for quick breakfasts, lunches, snacks, desserts, and more. They are also the first carbon-neutral meal kit company, and nearly all of their packaging is recyclable, with pre-portioned ingredients, meaning less prep and less food waste. And those portions do not skimp at all. They are deliciously generous. Plus, in partnership with Plastic Bank, HelloFresh prevents 10 million bottles from entering the ocean every year. So if you fancy giving it a go and cooking meals like this one, then visit hellofresh.com and use code RowanEllis21 for 21 free meals plus free shipping. Why do people ask if we still need coming out stories? For all the coming out scenes provide, there are some who question the relevance of them in today's media. It's a question I've seen from some older queer people. There, of course, is no deadline or timestamp to coming out. The journey can begin at any age from 15 to 50 and beyond, but for many older people in the queer community, they've already had their coming out stories, so the preoccupation with it can feel stale. But the existing stories of those who came out before aren't necessarily going to be relevant to today's young people or those of the future. There are different environments, attitudes, and even technologies in play. The experience of how I came out as a teenager will already differ from teens today, and that wasn't that long ago. It's also important to note that although many coming out scenes revolve around teenagers and young people fitting into the wider coming of age genre, there are exceptions. Christopher Plummer's character in Beginners, for example, gave us a newly out gay man in his 70s, a testament to both the rampant homophobia surrounding his earlier life and the capacity for people to find their own truth and happiness at any age. One of the most moving moments in Pride, which focuses on an ensemble cast of gay characters across a variety of ages, is that moment I mentioned earlier where Cliff, an older character, finally comes out to his friend Tafina. As I mentioned, coming out scenes are still needed by many to see how and what coming out may look like, and this should arguably arguably include the good as well as the more difficult iterations of the experience to show a well-rounded view and have the struggles that queer people faced when coming out acknowledged and reflected. Researchers at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology interviewed nearly 100 queer people for a journal publication. They wrote, "I'm a little surprised that coming out stories are still so important and that they still come across as stressful and difficult for young people today. Some critics have pointed out that more recent on-screen depictions do tend to lean more towards being simple and neat. Love, Simon's director, Greg Berlanti, mentioned in interviews that it was intentional for Love, Simon to present what journalist Glenn Weldon calls a well-scrubbed version of the coming out process so that queer kids can finally see an idealised version of themselves on screen." Berlanti said, "I think one was that we're in a romantic comedy, so we knew that we wanted, there is an idealised version of things that happen, or aspirational. So we were cognizant of that. It was important for us to have a blueprint for an aspirational reaction to your kid coming out."
So what happened then? When was the big moment?
The big moment.
When you said it. When you told your parents, I am gay.
Oh,
This is what we've been building towards, right? This is the climax of this whole story.
I mean, I guess
You have to do it for the video to end, right? So tell us, what happened?
I can't actually remember.
What do you mean?
No, I don't actually remember when I did it, or even if I did it in so many words. And well, actually, my parents.
No, take it again. This is the end of your story. Show us the pain you were feeling on the inside.
The pain.
Don't you want them to see your suffering? Don't you want them to learn a lesson from this?
It was at a family dinner. We were driving home from school and then we were in the middle of this big fight. And I just said it, those 3 words. I said, I am... No. I really can't remember. That is the truth. And it's not because of some terrible trauma or because it wasn't a big deal, but it's because it wasn't as simple as a neat one-scene announcement.
That isn't a story.
No, it's not. But it's what happened. And then... Well, I guess I had to come out of work. Well, I didn't have to, but I did. And then at school to some friends, actually, most of them didn't realise I've been trying to come out to them. So I had to do that again.
I think that's enough.
Sorry.
We have what we need.
But I need to... There's a whole other part to the story. I knew I was gay at that point, but figuring out my asexuality was still a few years off.
No, I think it's time for the story to end now. Can't you see it's come to an end? Roll the credits.
No. We aren't done. That wasn't the end of the story, not even close. Even in this moment, sitting here right now, isn't the end of the story. Don't you see? We have so much further to go. The other side of the coming out movie. Like every trope in cinema, coming out scenes can also have a tendency to become formulaic and repetitive, from the fraught familial rejection to the cliched I always knew lines. Often it feels like there's a tick box list, which culminates with the narrative closing once a character has revealed their sexuality and is out in the open. Yes, coming out movies can be important and impactful and play a huge role in the history of queer cinema, that isn't in doubt. It's a staple element of our rewriting of the traditional hetero and cis-normative coming-of-age story and can have incredible benefits for audiences regardless of their identities, but that doesn't mean that they're perfect or beyond a need to examine individual and collective patterns in these stories. Limiting repetition. For many who ask about the continued need for coming out stories, there is this sense of fatigue around the repetitive structure of these narratives, as well as the dialogue and actions that complete the structure. This rechurning of the same refrain has led to an easily parodied form, with phrases used for comedic and ironic effect in other media. Take Buffy the Vampire Slayer, whose mother Joyce responds to finding out her daughter's secret demon-killing identity with the question, "Have you tried not being the Slayer?" Or the infamous scene in X2 where the character Bobby comes out to his family as a mutant. The scene plays out exactly as you would expect a teen coming out scene to. The questioning of when did you know, his parents not able to say the word itself, the awkward reassurance that we still love you, it's just... And yes, even that same phrase, have you tried not being a mutant? For many, that repetition isn't just a case of a good trope overused, but an actively limiting set of blueprints for what a good queer story should be. In the book Homo Plot, the Coming Out Story and Gay, Lesbian and Bisexual Identity, Esther Saxey writes, critics both hostile and enthusiastic have read the coming out story as being repetitive, almost like a folk tale, always based on a series of stages and delivering the same closure. The comparison of the coming out story to a folktale or fairy tale is an interesting one. Both have certain narrative beats that are always met. The structure of a coming out story usually follows the character realizing they're not straight, their journey or quest to make this declaration when they need to, and the anticipated build-up of acceptance or rejection by the person or people they're coming out to. And then it ends with either a happy ending or with some understandable acceptance from either party, with the intended audience for the coming out not accepting the coming out, but it's okay because it was expected and they have a support network readily available. Or our protagonist has made internal peace with the fact that it went that way. In the essay Haptic Aesthetics and Queer Space in the new queer coming-of-age film, Zach Green notes the potential effects of such oversimplification. The political salience of the genre has diminished with each repetition. While most gay and liberal viewers can see the importance of this, coming out should be presented as a positive and healthy action. The irony is that this simplistic look at the world actually reduces the importance and even the imperative of the action of coming out. Green goes on to point out, the coming out film depicts only a fraction of queer experience and often confuses self-acceptance and narrative closure for the end of one's encounters with homophobia. Where the closed narrative of such mediums enforces a false image of completion, for all that coming out can signal a beginning for queer people, it is the cauterized ending for many queer narratives. Preoccupation with suffering. When I was researching for this video, I came across this quote by Canadian journalist Rachel Geese. It's a depressing experience for a queer moviegoer to see films that tell us over and over and over again that the world hates us and fears us, and that being ourselves might come at a cost. I think it puts across in a brilliantly succinct way the fact that the traditional coming out story narrative is predicated on fear. There has to be fear there to create the tension needed in storytelling, whether that fear ends up being founded or not. By attaching coming out to the typical 3-act structure, you have to include elements of uncertainty, suffering, turmoil, or similar mental or physical danger to set up stakes that will satisfy a Western audience. And that uncertainty and suffering is by necessity surrounding the act of coming out in these stories and the potential reactions to that revelation. If we look back at the narratives of coming out versus outing, although these are very different situations in reality, they are sometimes conflated in fiction or seen as being essentially the same in practice. In Love, Simon, for example, the movie seems uninterested in the trauma of being outed as being any different from the general idea of coming out, overly judging Simon and insinuating that he's a bad person for his actions while fearing being outed. And yes, you can argue that the elements of suffering in these movies reflect the experience of many queer people through history and even today, and they deserve to have their stories told, but when this is the crux of queer stories, how do we move forwards? When we only work to reinforce this fear, especially for young people, giving them this as the image of their own futures and how they should feel and fear, how can we honestly say we're helping? If our only focus is solely on coming out as the queer narrative, we'll always be stuck in this loop and between trauma in opposition to sugary sweetness, batting the two back and forth endlessly. Heteronormativity in coming-of-age narratives. Although coming out narratives can be seen to disrupt heteronormativity in a singular sense, critics have also argued that the genre as a whole is often forced into the shape of parallel experiences for straight peers. That aspect of the genre being used to explain queerness to straight and cis audiences means that many coming out stories only have LGBTQ+ audiences benefit as a secondary concern. The ideas of sex and romance that preoccupy straight narratives, loss of virginity, marriage, becoming a parent, are by their nature treated as thresholds through which lies a completeness, a sense of maturity that is a necessity for growing up. However, this preoccupation with a singular moment that defines the trajectory of our lives going forwards cannot necessarily be mapped directly onto coming out. It is not so much a singular doorway as a series of entrances and exits Scooby-Doo style, and not one that necessarily always heralds a forward momentum. It is also deeply internal, in a way that evades traditional filmmaking, or else leads them to well-worn cliches. A first kiss, a first wet dream, loss of virginity, wedding, childbirth can all be writ large in celluloid, but the complex and expansive wonderings and questionings of coming out to yourself in queerness are not so easy to capture. They're more ephemeral and insular, personal. Critic Green notes, meanwhile, the complications of representing the interiority of a queer child before they verbally disclose their sexual orientation cause innovation at the level of film form, leaving the exploration of such trickier temporalities to independent filmmakers. Not just the exploration and discovery of sexuality, but also the consequences of coming out often fall victim to the neatly packaged world of heteronormative coming-of-age stories. Repercussions for a childhood supposedly full of fraught loneliness and confusion are often absent altogether once a reconciliation scene with a parent is done. Green again speaks on this in regards to the mainstream teen movie Love, Simon. The film depicts a fantasy of acceptance into a benevolent heteropatriarchy, especially reserved for the right kind of queer, referring to the conspicuously white cis middle class aspects of Simon's identity, which also have him literally saying he is just like you and isn't that gay, while sidelining a black queer gender non-conforming character Ethan as the more undesirable alternative. Simon is as close as he can possibly be to the appropriate nice white boy protagonist of so many Hollywood movies, except for that one element, minimizing the differences and making him as palatable as possible for straight audiences. And sure, that's totally fine for that movie, but what other stories and possibilities are being sidelined if that is the blueprint for coming out movies across the board? When you replicate that same idea of heterosexual success and comfort onto queer characters, as critics Carl Schoonover and Rosaline Galt argue in their book Queer Cinema and the World, you risk limiting queer aspirations to the same bourgeoisie citizenship, repressive institutions, and limited lives that hetero society prescribes. Think about how Love, Simon's opening and closing are mirrored so specifically, reusing the same shot of the carpool to school and the Starbucks coffee cups, the only change being that at the end Simon's boyfriend is also present, as if to say, don't worry, nothing has to progress or be thought about differently, you'll still be allowed to assimilate back into your old world. Except we know from the movie itself that that world is a homophobic one. The ending has the optics of inclusion, but the reality seems far from it. When the close of the coming out movie is rooted in a happy ending depending on acceptance back into the straight family unit or amongst straight peers, and queer characters are condemned for anger or acting out of fear, what message is that really sending? We see the consequences of this in the praising of coming out stories as universal, with the minimizing of the queerness that is in reality at the center of the narrative. Green discusses, for example, the reception to Moonlight, a movie about a black queer young man as he grows up. Ironically, much of the film's critical discourse in popular outlets obscured its queerness and blackness in favor of framing the story as universal. An example of this is evident in the New York Times' A.O. Scott's description of the film, who suggests that although it would be accurate enough to describe Moonlight as a movie about growing up poor, black and gay, this characterization would be misleading, as it would be truer to say that it's about teaching a child to swim, about cooking a meal for an old friend, about the feeling of sand on skin and the sound of waves on a darkened beach, about first kisses and lingering regrets. This universalizing of the movie is clearly meant to be a compliment, but why? Why is the film more worthy when you downplay or even erase entirely the specifics of black and queer experiences within it? Specifics written by a black and queer man, Terrell Alvin McCreary. Straight audiences are so used to movies being for them, they see the claiming of these stories by them as the highest compliment. I think it's really telling that this discussion and the question of do we still need coming out stories is not a new one at all. We see it back in the 80s and 90s even. In Marnie A. Brown's essay Coming Out Narratives, Realities of Intersectionality, they talk about the idea that in the 1990s, a post-closet framework emerged, arguing that coming out of the closet has become more common and less difficult. Going on to quote another essay, Beyond the Closet, The Changing Social Meaning of Homosexuality in the United States from 1999, American homosexuals have normalized and routinized their homosexuality to a degree where the closet plays a lesser role in their lives. But this attitude wasn't universally accepted either. Patrick Wilde, the writer of the play What's Wrong with Angry, which was adapted into the iconic queer coming-of-age movie Get Real, specifically wrote it to combat the idea that coming out was a thing of the past. I wrote the play because I had something to say. I was sick of being told by people that it's easier to be gay now. I don't believe it's easier than it ever was to come out. All the pressures from your peers, from your parents, are still there, and no amount of legislation is going to change that. Why haven't we moved on from the 80s? We're still asking the same question now, do we still need coming out stories? Then do we still need them? It's not the coming out itself that's out of date or no longer a concern for young queer people or those new to discovering their identity at any age. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the question we should be asking instead is what is missing from queer narratives, including queer coming out stories? As noted previously, coming out narratives can be repetitive and they're telling stationary. What can be added or changed to that narrative to steer us from concluding that coming out stories need to go altogether? The first step towards improving coming out narratives is perhaps to have more of them, but allow the spotlight to be shone on different identities. The coming out stories that we do have tend to centre around white, cis, able-bodied and allosexual characters. Coming out narratives around asexual identities are practically non-existent, and historically people of colour rarely appear in coming out narratives, and when they do, are often sidelined. Take Ethan from Love, Simon, for example. As I mentioned earlier, Ethan is a student at Simon's high school who is black and openly gay. However, the film never explores that side of the story. As Rachel Geese puts it, despite Ethan having blazed a path for Simon by coming out years earlier and having endured homophobic bullying with his advanced level shade, Simon never pursues a friendship with Ethan nor seeks out his support. As Simon has already made clear, he doesn't like anything or anyone too gay. Simon's distance from Ethan and the internalized homophobia that the distance suggests are quickly glossed over. It's a lost opportunity to tell more of Ethan's story. How did this kind, confident, interesting kid become comfortable in his skin? What's been his experience being an openly gay teenager? But Ethan is just a side note to the main event of Simon's big reveal. This marginalisation of the black gay experience continues with the character of Bram, Simon's love interest, who he chats to under the username Blue. Bram is black and Jewish, and how those identities intersect with his queer one are never explored, because he's just another supporting character on Simon's journey. As Green points out, the film takes no interest in fleshing out the complexities of his experience of being a queer of colour, nor does it offer any kind of characterisation to Simon's friends, Abby and Nick, both of whom are black. His romantic pairing with Bram brings to mind Bell Hooks' notion of eating the other, where when otherness is commodified, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture. Thus, the film's multiculturalism is purely ornamental. So despite having multiple queer black characters, Love, Simon never actually explores those characters or identities with any meaningful depth. The lack of intersecting diversity within coming out stories is maybe the most obvious way that existing cinematic narratives don't represent the reality of being queer today, but there's far more to it. I would also argue that we need more representation of queer communities within coming out stories. So often, coming out narratives are about coming out to straight friends and family, and potentially one queer love interest thrown in there as well. We rarely see queer characters become friends with other queer people or receive guidance from queer peers or older community members. Movies like But I'm a Cheerleader and Pride do an amazing job of including queer communities in coming out narratives in a way that feels authentic, but they're not the norm. It's much more likely for the only queer person in a coming out narrative to be the person who's coming out and maybe their love interest, or what's worse, throwing in a flamboyant queer character for the protagonist to distance themselves from. You know, because they're gay, but not that kind of gay. Yes, I am talking to you, Call Me By Your Name and Love, Simon. But even if you added a queer community to many of these movies, there's still significant ways that they wouldn't necessarily feel realistic. And that's because, as mentioned earlier, the traditional narrative structure of a coming out movie is inherently in opposition to the actual experience of coming out for many people. As summarised by River H. Kiro, teens are often repeatedly told to have certain expectations for when they come out, and it usually looks a bit like this. You will keep your gayness or transness a secret for a long time. You may tell one or two trusted friends. Your secret will inevitably get out, or you will be put in a position where you have to tell your parents, guardian, mentor, etc. They will not react well, but in the end, all will be forgiven. And while this story may ring true for some, it's not true for all queer people, and it's not the whole truth. For one, you might not keep your identity a secret for that long, and some people don't realise that they're queer until well into adulthood. So not discovering your identity is a different experience to knowing your identity and keeping it hidden. Or maybe you figure out your identity with your friends and family. It's becoming increasingly typical for coming outs to be replaced by ongoing conversations around exploring your sexuality. Also, not all parental figures are going to react negatively, and a lot of people never come out to parental figures at all, or don't forgive them for their reactions to coming out. But what bugs me the most about this structure is the finality of it. This idea that you come out once and that's it, you're done. Obviously, that isn't true. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that most coming out moments either happen at the start of the film or the end of it, but unlike in the movies, you never come out just once. You'll most likely come out again and again and again to new people, new friends, new co-workers, that random lady at the grocery store that asks if your brother is your husband, and you have to decide whether you should come out to them and how and when. Your identity might also evolve over time, and the label you initially come out as might not fit anymore. Or you might find another identity that you also identify with. Look at Lil Nas X. After previously identifying as gay, he now identifies as bisexual. Elliot Page identified as a lesbian before identifying as a trans man, and those are both very common experiences. Coming out is never the end of your journey as a queer person. As Hayden Manders puts it in one article, Just because someone comes out as gay doesn't mean they're done coming out. For me, feeling confident enough to embrace my homosexuality was one thing. It took years of frustration and self-loathing to understand that my identity is more feminine than other cisgender homosexual men around me. I may not have ever properly come out, whatever that means, as a femme, but stepping out in outfits and a manner that is decidedly more femme is, in a way, an inherent coming out, because it's rooted in self-confidence. Like for me, you might have thought, Rowan, hey, considering that you don't remember the moment that you came out to your parents, which is meant to be a big deal, maybe next, if you have to come out again as something, you might want to remember it. Absolutely not. I do not remember when I figured out I was asexual, when I first told someone. I truly have no idea. The only clue that I have is that I use this website where you can write yourself an email and it sends to you a year in the future. And I know for a fact, because I looked it up the other day, that my 2015 email mentioned the fact that I was asexual. And I know it happened after I knew I was gay. I don't know what happened in between those two things, because for some people, it is a very long, complex process. But for me, the asexual thing was like not necessarily something that I was struggling with, right? Like it wasn't a thing that I was remembering because it was a negative thing that was happening. It was just a series of realizations. And actually the same with me coming out as gay initially. I knew, hence why I walked across the room in that fateful PSHE lesson, that being gay is not an inherently bad thing. I was very into equality and human rights and all that kind of stuff at the time. And so for me, it wasn't so much a case of like, oh, I'm having a really dramatic, fraught time in my head. It was, I just had to figure it out. I just had to work through the clues of the compulsive heterosexuality and figure out that I was in fact gay. It turns out everyone's coming out story is different. Who knew? Because that's right, coming out doesn't necessarily have to be a dramatic, tear-jerking conversation. Coming out can mean casually mentioning your partner in a conversation with your work friends, or checking a box on a medical form, or even just wearing certain clothes. Sometimes no words are needed, which is great because in some stories there are no words for coming out anyway. If you think about historical dramas, for example, any coming out narrative would feel anachronistic, I guess. Both coming out and queerness, after all, are relatively recent social constructs. The film Alexander takes place in 285 BCE in ancient Macedonia. You can't really have a scene where Alexander the Great sits down with his parents and says, hey guys, I'm bisexual. I mean, you could, but that would be a choice. Period dramas set in later periods of history, which have the societal presumption of heterosexuality, might still not have coming out scenes due to a lack of modern language around the experience. While Portrait of a Lady on Fire, set in the late 18th century, has a lesbian love story, neither character explicitly uses that word to describe themselves, partially because lesbianism as an identity didn't exist. While the word lesbian did exist at this time, it wasn't commonly used in reference to homosexuality until the 1890s. While the identities existed, the labels did not. And that's still true today. There isn't a label for every identity or for every relationship, and it doesn't mean that those relationships or identities aren't real, or that we can't have stories about people forming these relationships and discovering these identities. You can demonstrate a character's identity through nonverbal cues, or a character can simply describe their experience or feelings without trying to force them into a neat box and word. You can still have a story about discovering your queer identity without requiring the characters to verbalize a specific sexuality. And we have examples of this. Movies like The Half of It and even Moonlight do that really well. But what about stories for characters who are already comfortable with who they are? Where are the stories that go beyond coming out itself as a concept? In the paper, Not Just a Phase, Queer Girlhood and Coming of Age on Screen, Whitney Monaghan says that the coming of age trope sees queer youth coming of age only by coming to terms with their sexuality and/or gender identity and verbally articulating it. Once they come out, queer youth either mature immediately into adulthood or written out because their only possible storyline has concluded. One of the most frustrating things about the popularity of coming out films for a lot of people is that it means that most mainstream portrayals of queer people never get beyond that point. Take, for example, Moonlight. The film ends with Chiron confessing to Kevin that he is the only man he's ever been intimate with. While some people admire the chaste but tender ending, others felt frustrated. One critic, Ronaldo Walcott, stated that the film seems to stall at the possibility of being able to represent black queer men having sex beyond the stereotype. Indeed, actual black queer men fuck every day beyond the stereotype. Art that cannot produce or represent that moment fails in a certain way. And this frustration goes beyond not seeing queer characters have sex. Queer audiences want to see those those characters in a variety of storylines that don't require a character to reckon with their sexual identity? What experiences, challenges, and milestones might queer people have after that? In an interview with Salon, librarian Hel Patnott said that teen readers are looking for books where the queer characters can do other things, where it's not just all about them being queer, and then they're also looking for books where the main character is queer and that's the whole plot. I think what they're really asking for is a range of choices. So yes, give us more queer coming out stories, but also give us queer protagonists who rob banks, get divorced, fight monsters, solve crimes. Give us queer protagonists who are still discovering their identity and also who know exactly who they are. Give us queer characters in happy relationships, troubled marriages, actively dating, and wonderfully single. Better representation is never a matter of either or, it's a matter of yes and. Overly relying on closeted characters and coming out storylines is limiting. As Rachel Geese puts it, this preoccupation feels as stifling as the closet itself. Filmmakers seem to have no idea what to do with people who are already out, who are, to paraphrase the old protest signs, here queer and used to it. Coming out is a profound and dramatic moment, but what about all the other moments in our lives? In teen movies in particular, straight characters usually have to deal with a whole myriad of issues at the same time. So why can't it be the same for queer teens as well? Our queerness isn't the only part of who we are, and coming out is far from the only challenge we face. So why are we so obsessed with portrayals with only one fraction of our experience? Some critics, like Ruby Rich, in the book New Queer Cinema, suggest that more radical queer films began to die out in the late 90s, as more mainstream heterosexual directors became interested in making films with queer characters. To appeal to a wider market, these directors largely ignored politics and focused on love stories and coming out stories, both of which adhered to a clean but inauthentic narrative. These movies didn't totally ignore the suffering of queer youth. On the contrary, the films frequently turn the characters' queerness into the central obstacle, the source of their suffering. Only by acknowledging the truth of who they are could these characters be set free. As Gila Padva states in Edge of 17, melodramatic coming out in new queer adolescent films, the spectacular visualization of coming out as the ideal solution of gay youth's agony is a naive illusion. It's an appealing illusion to straight audiences. The biggest obstacle a queer character faces in a coming out story is often themselves. Sure, there might be a homophobic parent or classmate, but victory and conclusion comes when the character finds the courage to be who they truly are. All the straight characters have to do is offer vague emotional support or even just understanding, not anything beyond that. Coming out stories still have an important place in cinema, I'm not denying that, but the discussion, to my mind, shouldn't be so much around if this narrative should continue, but more about if they're truly reflective and authentic of the experiences of coming out today, especially if we look at the spread of stories being told, not just focusing on one movie at a time in this analysis. And beyond that, coming out stories detail one part of a queer person's journey. There are so many more beyond that milestone that deserve to be explored on screen. Coming out and allowing room to explore your sexuality is not as linear and straightforward as it's often portrayed on screen. It can be complex, messy, multifaceted, and the stories we tell about that process should be allowed to be too. It's not that we no longer need coming out stories, but we need to develop beyond just that, to complicate them, to allow them to be messy and diverse. The idea that this very neat story where the solution to the agony of queer youth is simply to come out is ultimately lazy. If this is the only aspect that's talked about, we have to balance the need for nice, sweet stories reaching for something aspirational for queer youth to give them a positive way to live while modelling supportive behaviour to straight audiences. We have to balance that with stories that acknowledge the reality of people in our community who have a much more difficult time, whose stories are still worth telling. That will only come with more stories, but stories are allowed to exist complexly and authentically. I'm not a supporter of this idea that we should aim for a day where no one has to come out. I want coming out to be something that can be casual and commonplace if you want, but can also be special and joyous and celebratory, something that we can create traditions around as a community, to be a rite of passage that isn't mired in fear. I don't think we have to get rid of the concept altogether, but instead allow it to be a narrative that can be reclaimed, a new story to be created. Because we aren't done. That wasn't the end of the story, not even close. Even in this moment, sitting right here, it isn't the end of the story. Don't you see? We have so much further to go. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you would like to help support videos like this one, then I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description, along with all my social media links. You can find me all over the internet, and I'll see you next time. Bye.